Hello, family members. Hope you're having a nice day today. I would like to talk to you today about something it's not an easy topic, and I don't have easy answers. I'm just wanting to have a discussion here, and I hope you join me. So I'm going to start out with the story about Derek Roby and Eric Smith. If you are unfamiliar, Eric Smith was 13 years old when he brutally murdered 4-year-old Derek Roby. He confessed, and he was sentenced to, I believe, 9 to life or something like that. A significant prison sentence. I was watching a 48 Hours episode. I'm in like a documentary mood. I want things like that, kind of recent history stories. And I decided to give it a shot. And I watched most of this story about Eric Smith eventually getting parole. And I believe 2021, something like that. After he had spent, decades, I believe, in jail, more than he had spent out of jail by a significant margin. He had grown up from a 13-year-old boy to a man, and then spent several more years, maybe decades. And, he'd gone through the parole process and been denied multiple times. And the real focus, the real tone of the story that I was watching was talking about how horrible it was for his parents that he kept getting up for parole every couple of years, and then they had to beg to keep him in prison. And I was watching it, and I was listening to this news magazine elicit, very deep confessions about very heartfelt, hurtful emotions. And it made me angry because nobody, apparently, in this process stopped to consider that, no, they didn't. They didn't have to. They chose to. When they were notified that their son's killer was up for parole, they had a choice about whether or not they wanted to say something. And whether or not they had said anything, the parole board still would have done a thorough job. Maybe they would have let him out sooner if the family hadn't been so obviously against it. But who's to say? I don't know that. The family doesn't know that. It's just really sad to see that our justice system is so messed up that those people essentially felt like they had to choose to re-victimize themselves every couple of years, starting about a decade after their son's killer went to jail. That's... Okay. We have a real problem when it comes to crime and punishment in this country. We have a system that is set up on the principles of rehabilitation, but also the principles of punishment. And those two goals are mutually exclusive for a prison system. If your goal is to rehabilitate people, to help them get whatever they need as far as resources, education, mental health supports, whatever, so that after they have, paid their debt to society, so to speak, that they can go back into society and be a better citizen than they were when they went in. Or you want to make prison as unpleasant as possible and punish people for their wrongdoing. Those are the two choices. You don't really get both. Because in order to focus on rehabilitation, you have to accept that sometimes you'll be helping someone who doesn't really deserve it, who isn't really going to take anything from it, that probably did deserve punishment because they are unrepentant and genuinely dangerous to society. And we can work with those people as much as we want. People who are just innately cruel and find harming others to be an enjoyable experience for them. The best we can do is try to determine when there are people like that that are beyond any sort of rehabilitation, who they are, and make sure that they are safely isolated away from the general population so that the harms that they can do are limited, very limited. But the majority of people who commit a crime are not like that. The majority of people who commit a crime, probably with the right supports, could be quote unquote rehabilitated, could be given the tools and support they need to be able to rejoin the public after their period of incarceration and be a better citizen. And to me, it feels like right now our justice system is more focused on punishment. Although it says it has principles of rehabilitation, punishment is really the main point. And that makes people worse citizens when they come out, for the most part. Now, there can be cases where, say, like Eric Smith maybe even be a good case of this, although I don't know the specifics of his life enough to say for certain. But, in his case, he had such a long time and apparently did eventually take the time to grow and accept responsibility for what he did. And being incarcerated for as long as he did, yeah, that gave him time to come out as a better citizen. But that's because we're comparing him to a 13-year-old boy who killed a child for fun. It's not that much harder, or it's not very hard to be better than that. The bar was super low. And so if the bar is super low, maybe going into prison, you can come out a better person. But if somebody is not an irredeemable human being, which most people are not, going into prison is going to make them harder, more cynical. It's going to make it harder for them to assimilate into any community ever going forward. We punish people beyond whatever their sentence is at trial. not usually white collar criminals, but anybody who's not a white collar criminal, this pretty much applies to. We expect that sex offenders will not be treated well in prison. And I know that there are a lot of people who think that is appropriate. And that is disturbing to me, because that's extrajudicial punishment that the system pretty much knows exists, but doesn't do anything to fix. What we've done, what we've created in the United States is a system where once someone is convicted of a crime, they become a criminal. Their essential being is somehow changed, and now they are now less than the rest of us. And they deserve any punishment they get, no matter what their crime is. You know? People talk with such derision about criminals. And it's so funny to me because nearly every person in the United States commits crimes. They drive too fast, run a stop sign, do a rolling stop at a stop sign. How about that? I know a lot of people who do that. Park in the wrong place, or like Hunter Biden, be the kind of person who smokes weed and goes and buys a gun, and then technically you've committed a crime because they make you say that you don't use drugs. I mean, there are a lot of people who commit a lot of crimes, some of which are consequential and some of which really are not, that those crimes never get enforced. Those laws never get enforced. They only get enforced when there's some other reason, when they can be used as a tool against someone who has been targeted for some reason, Again, Hunter Biden is kind of a good example with that. The only reason he was prosecuted for the crime that he was prosecuted for, the gun charge, is because of who his father was. It was malicious, politically, based, malignant enforcement of the law. It was not something that was done out of doing a good for society. It was, what can we dig up on this person who was a known drug addict and be able to charge him with something? And the way that our country criminalizes drug addiction means that you can pretty much find some way to charge some crime to somebody if they have a history or are a drug addict. And that's the point of anti-drug laws, by the way. Nixon basically said it. He got rid of, or he started enforcing against pot because he wanted to have a requisite to go after the hippies, the anti-war protesters. And he did the same thing with cocaine as a way of going after black people, because he knew that hippies a lot of the time smoke weed, or that people a lot of the time would do cocaine or other recreational party drugs. He knew that when he wanted to, persecute a person from that group, intimidate them for any reason, he would have that sort of base assumption that they were a criminal in some way that they could use as a beginning point for harassing any individual that they chose to. And it's not to say that the hippies and the blacks were the only people using cocaine or pot, because they weren't. We know that. It's just, if you're like a white guy who is on Nixon's side politically, you think he's ever going to, go after you for those crimes? No. He just wants to have the ability, the prerequisite, to target the people he wants. And his policy is still in place today. A lot of it is still in place today. Right now, I'm a medical marijuana card holder. Later on this week, when it's time for me to buy weed, I'll go on my phone, I'll place an order. A few hours later, a delivery driver will come to me. I'll be able to use an app on my phone to pay, and then I'll be able to get marijuana. But there are people who are in prison right now for doing what I'll be doing with the clear approval of my state government. Which I'm glad, by the way. I do want to say that. I'm glad that at least for some of us, medical marijuana is a possibility. Because when it comes to nerve pain, which I have, there's like nothing else that is anywhere as good. I would have a hard time functioning without medical marijuana. So I'm glad that it is at least somewhat available. But it's also really, really frustrating and hard to deal with the truth that I am privileged enough to be able to do that, where others have spent their whole lives suffering, where entire families have been ruined over drug arrests, over people doing things not dissimilar from what I will be doing later on this week. There's a really good music video by Stephen Marley and Damian Marley. I think it's like Medication Gets Me High or something. Medication, maybe it's just the name of the song. And in it, it juxtaposes the imagery of a prison and a grow house, a grow laboratory. And it's genuinely sickening to have it illustrated that bluntly. But it's so necessary. It's so important, right? Because it's such a horrible contradiction. We forget that law is not a black and white thing. It's not like you commit a crime and then you're immediately prosecuted for that crime and given a standard sentence. That's not how it works at all. We only see crimes enforced under specific circumstances. Just because something is against the law doesn't mean that the local law enforcement will have even the ability to enforce that law, even if they want to. Here in my town, it's against the city rules and laws and all that to have fireworks within the city limits. But we also don't have a city cop or a police force. We just, contract from the county. Every holiday, there are professional grade fireworks things going off all around me, different households. People in my city love fireworks. And it doesn't matter that they are criminals, because they do what they want to do. and nobody's ever going to prosecute them for it, unless some sort of weird, unlucky thing happens and someone gets hurt, and then they can use that law against people. It's selective enforcement. So we already have selective enforcement. We already have a pretty bad system as far as getting incorrect convictions. Interrogation techniques are hopelessly outdated. I mean, the whole science of profiling is pretty much junk. It's useless. A lot of things that you see in CSI that they used to solve crimes are pretty much useless. Hair analysis, bite mark analysis, that's all been completely debunked. Fingerprints, it's been shown that there are people who are unrelated who have basically very similar fingerprints. And so fingerprint analysis is not enough in certain circumstances to know what happened. Like, there are so many debunked, criminal science measures that get still cited in court because there's precedent for it. That's how the law works. Law and science don't work the same way. In science, you can say this is our working theory, but if new things come and supersede that, then you toss that out. In the court, you go by what has been decided before. And so at some point, when we knew less about this particular scientific discipline, this type of analysis was seen as valid. But now we know it's not. But the courts can't let it go. I mean, polygraph machines are useless. They cannot tell you anything, really, because it's very easy for some people to lie when they're being tested by a polygraph, and very easy for people who aren't lying to get completely nervous or give off weird readings. We never freaking learn, do we? I mean, I still think about Lindy Chamberlain a lot. People didn't think that she acted right after her baby was, taken and eaten by dingoes. And so she ended up spending years in prison, giving birth to her baby, one of her babies, in prison, partially because people didn't think that she acted right. And every time that I try to watch true crime now, I can't get very far, because you'll hear law enforcement on there very confidently saying things like, profile this person, or, they didn't act the way you would expect someone to act after blah, blah, blah. Everybody acts so differently under stressful circumstances. Trying to, reach inside someone's mind and heart and decide what they're thinking or saying, or where their mind is, what their level of guilt is, based on suppositions that we make, observations that we make about them and how they behave. That's wildly, wildly inaccurate, I mean, that's how you end up with stuff like the Salem witch trials. If a horrible thing happens, like when Derek Roby was murdered, the impulse is to find out what happened and punish whoever was involved. And in that case, it didn't take too long for law enforcement to realize what had happened, because, 13-year-old boys are not subtle. And that's one scenario where they got it right, absolutely 100% right. But then you have situations like the Central Park, the exonerated five. The Central Park jogger case, where 5 young men were aggressively and wrongfully prosecuted for a crime that they didn't commit. And why? Because there was so much pressure on law enforcement and prosecutors to get justice. But just convicting somebody of a crime isn't getting justice. People who commit violent acts sometimes become the type of people who do that as a pattern. And it is important for us to find those deviant actors within society and isolate them and determine if they sincerely can be rehabilitated or not, what supports they need to be rehabilitated. But there are also people that we need to find and get out of the population, like the Golden State Killer, the Green River Killer. These mostly men who, change locations, change MOs, but go through their entire adult life until they are stopped harming other people, because there's just something fundamental about who they are that leads them to do that. And in our quest to get quick, easy convictions, people like that have gotten away with murder many, many times. I think about John Benet Ramsey a lot. I was of the right age to be fascinated by her case, but also her mother was a former Miss West Virginia, and being a West Virginia girl, I felt a connection. Her family, I don't think will ever get justice. I don't think she'll ever get justice. The police were so convinced that they knew that it was the parents that were involved, that they ignored lots of very clear evidence that that wasn't the case. And now here we are decades later, and people who were involved aren't even alive anymore. And what are the odds that the person who murdered her never murdered anyone else after he got away with killing her? What are the odds that he's not out there doing that right now? I don't know. We do such a bad job of finding the real, true bad actors, while at the same time incarcerating thousands of our neighbors and friends and family in a police-driven corrections machine that will use them as slave labor, that will subject them to cruel and unusual punishment, and that will, once they have paid their debt to society, continue punishing them for the rest of their lives. And I don't think that is a good way for us to deal with crime. I mean, it hasn't stopped crime from happening. It hasn't stopped sexual assault from happening. We have to learn to actually readjust our idea of what should and shouldn't be illegal. this bizarre idea that you can legislate people into moral behavior is futile, you know? There are other countries in the world that are doing a much better job dealing with this complex, nuanced topic. How do you handle deviant actors in society? How do you reform those who can be reformed? And how do you determine who is beyond reform and help make sure that they cannot harm others? We have no real answers to any of those questions here. What we have is a private, for-profit prison system that benefits from more bodies being there. What we have are prosecutors who are judged by their conviction rate instead of whether or not the convictions they get are truly accurate. It's more beneficial for them to send an innocent person to prison than to have an innocent person be acquitted. And that should not be the incentive structure in court, okay? Like, it should be incentivized for law enforcement and for prosecutors to go in and be certain that they're right to question themselves and their own methods. But that is not the system that we have. And it's just getting worse. And part of the reason that we're letting it happen is this idea that a person can be intrinsically a criminal and that they deserve whatever they get. So I encourage you, family members, to start dismantling that structure in your own mind, because you never know when they're going to decide they will come for you. And maybe it's better for us to start working on this before that can happen to all of us. All right, family members, this was a fun, super not depressing at all topic. I hope you're having a nice day. I did mention in my community post I was making Cass Elliot shirts because I couldn't find any that I liked, and so this is the first one that of the 3 that I made. If you do like this, if you're a Cass Elliot fan like mine, if you're mad that all Cass Elliot merch says Mama Cass, even though she didn't like being called Mama Cass, I have 3 designs up in my Redbubble store. There's a link in my community post if you're interested. I also post lots of pictures of the animals in my community post.